I woke up to a loud bang, the kind that jolts your brain awake, setting off the forces of fight or flight, leaving all reasonable thoughts straggling, the synapses encumbered by total panic. The dream had floated away as reality desperately pushed through. In zombie-like half-consciousness, I struggled to piece together the direction of the sound, but my mind insisted it had come from everywhere at once. I checked the bedside tables for things that might have fallen, and the floors for anything broken. I found no evidence of either. I began to walk through my house, waking up the different rooms by switching the lights on as I went. Hallway, kitchen, living room, bathroom. They all seemed untouched, and like innocent bystanders, they joined in on my confusion. Completely awake by then, I decided to get a glass of water and sit down for a moment. My mind had mostly bounced back to its default, reality-based mode of operations, and the alertness of awakeness had overtaken me. I decided to stay up for a moment. Sleep wouldn't come for a while, anyway, and the sound might have simply been a product of the now-forgotten dream. But I wanted to be sure that everything was fine. Behind me, outside the house, I heard an echoing screech, as if something screamed for its last breath, both asking for help as well as alerting others of the danger they've come upon. Although it wasn't a bang, I immediately thought that the two sounds must be related. They were both harsh and unusual. I quickly got up and looked out the window. Nothing moved in the faint light of the moon, but in the distance lay the darkness of the forest. In that black forest dwell animals, hunters, and sometimes even campers. It was surprisingly popular for being in the middle of nowhere, but then again, such dense forests were a rarity in this part of the country. Now, were it surely just an animal, I would have let it go. I don't interfere with nature. But I had lived in that house for years, and I'd never before heard such a screech. Not that I could say with certainty that it was human either, but I felt it to be my duty to investigate. And with all the possible explanations and their corresponding uncertainties swirling in my mind as question-marked patterns, sleep wouldn't come for a long while anyway. I grabbed a torch, put on my boots and coat, and headed out. Outside the tree lane, the torch worked alongside the moonlight, giving a clear view of where it was pointed, but even outside its gaze, I could make out the grassy terrain. Once I stepped into the forest, it was a different story. All natural light was quenched of its prowess, and the beam of the torch was precisely defined, showing its contents in yellowish hue, and leaving the rest black and unmapped, the half-visible branches of the trees like claws desperately trying to penetrate the light. I'd learned how to traverse the woodland quite well, and I even had an instinctual map of the bigger roots and rocks, which my legs avoided with ease as I walked. Frankly, I was somewhat surprised at my own aptitude, but grateful as well. If there was someone in the woods, I'd be sure to find them. I walked instinctually, allocating my thoughts to what I might find, and depending on the answer, what I should do. If it was people, I could show them back to my house, and were they in need of help, I could call an ambulance. In the case of an animal, I could hopefully muster a mercy kill, or call the local animal control center to come assess the situation. Man or animal, neither seemed like a good option, but even if it was nothing at all, I knew it'd weigh on my conscience not to have investigated. As I went deeper into the forest, it only got darker, and I had to reallocate most of my efforts into assessing my surroundings. I usually didn't walk that far, so my instinct-based map of the forest floor was no longer of much help. I had to slow down my pace to keep myself from getting snagged on roots and branches. Soon the air started to feel colder, and I could see my breath coming out as puffs in the beam of the torch. The treetops sometimes gave way to splatters of the sky like a dark and dead Pollock painting through which I could glimpse at the outside like a prisoner. My ears were perked in search of sounds ruffling, walking, voices, yet they found nothing at all. Something seemed off, as even sleeping forests are never completely quiet. It was like someone had muted it. I wasn't sure if it had been like this since I started walking, but the act of noticing the quietness itself seemed to point to the opposite. Something made it quiet. Soon I walked into a small clearing surrounded by an unusually circular set of trees. Their branches made their best effort to block out the sky, but the clearing was large enough that they couldn't quite entangle, leaving a more or less round snippet of the sky open, the silver moonlight eagerly piercing through it. As I stared at the illuminated trees, wondering if I should simply head back, my ears reported a sound. Like the bang that woke me up, it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. It sounded like clicks at first, like rocks thrown on rocks, click, click, clack, but it quickly picked up in speed until it sounded like small hammers carving rocks. Hastily I looked around me, pointing the torch between the trees, but I couldn't see anything. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking as it tried to recover from a half-night of sleep. The clicks came closer, and I realized that all the trees looked the same now, and I could no longer be sure of where I'd come from. My instincts had failed me, and panic began to set in as I tried to retrace my steps. The clicking came closer and closer, louder and louder. I spotted some branches I was sure were broken by my boots. Yes, they must have been my doing. I walked towards them as the clicking became almost unbearably loud, monopolizing the freezing airspace with its unnaturalness. Once I was sure that I'd found my path back home, the forest became silent again. Maybe because it was the only place I hadn't looked yet, I slowly turned my torch upwards, following its beam in agonizing fright. In the trees, between their myriad black branches, was the head of a donkey. Its beheaded neck was tangled in taut, muscular tendrils that held it mid-air by holding onto the branches. They were oily wet, dripping with blood and mucus. And the head, defiled. Its fleshy eyes shone red. There were no eyelids. Its lips were ripped clean off, leaving a serrated, black edge. And between those lips were its sharp, half-broken teeth, stained in a collage of blacks and browns and reds, and the teeth began to chatter, its jaws like jack drills. Clickly-ck. I pointed my torch forwards and ran. The chattering followed me, and once again, it seemed to come from all sides. I dared not look backwards in case I'd lose my footing, but I could hear it brushing along the treetops, its slick tendrils whipping at the branches as the head swung like a monkey, rustling the trees at its beckoning. There was only one direction which led out of the forest, and I prayed I was on it. As I ran, there was no instinct, no familiarity with the terrain. But I had to get out, and there was no time to assess. No time to think. Soon I could see slivers of light penetrating the trees, and between them, far in the distance, I saw glimpses of my house. The chattering was closing in on me, but somehow I managed to outrun it. That was until I got right to the edge of the woods. Before the pain, I heard a whipping sound. Then came the unbearable sear. One of the tendrils had snapped at my shin, tearing through my pant leg like a knife and going through my flesh until it hit the bone. I could feel the hot blood flowing down my shin as my sock gobbled it up like a sponge. The chattering echoed through the open grass as I limped towards the front door. But that same echo revealed to me that it hadn't been able to exit the forest. Finally, with excruciating pain as I dragged my torn leg, I made it inside and locked the door behind me. The walls silenced the chattering enough for me to focus on finding the first aid kit. My leg left a scarily large streak of blood from the front door to the bathroom, where I threw out everything in the cupboard until I spotted the small red pouch with white text. Thankfully, the wound wasn't wide, so I didn't need to immediately have it stitched. With some disinfectant and tight bandages, I got the worst of the bleeding to stop. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain became almost unbearable. But the worst was the chattering. It was still going on, and I felt like the escaped prey of some unholy beast that yearned for nothing more than to feast on my flesh, to finish what it had started. With that thing out there, I couldn't go to the hospital. The road went alongside the forest, and that was a risk I dared not to take. And I didn't want to call an ambulance either. I'm not so dense as to subject others to whatever I was hunted by. The only productive action I could think of was to look out the window at the tree line. If it's to attack, I would at least have a fighting chance if I could see it coming. And so I dragged a chair to the window overlooking the forest, sat down and waited. Nothing moved in the sterile moonlight, but I could hear the chattering in the trees. I waited until the sun came up, and with the light of day, the chattering slowly ceased, like it burrowed into the forest itself, waiting for its next opportunity. My legs started to feel worse during the morning, so I decided I had no choice but to go to the hospital. As I drove, I couldn't help but stare at the trees more than the road, but it was familiar enough that I could have driven it with my eyes shut. The doctor sealed up my leg and gave me some antibiotics. For some reason I was not expecting him to ask what happened, but of course he did, and I stammered something about farming equipment. He told me to be more careful, which was sound advice either way. I got back home and the air was neat, filled with birdsong and relaxed wind. The sun put a smile on my face, and I thought that perhaps the previous night didn't even really happen. The sudden bang that awoke me, along with the screech and the flippant hallucinogenic quality of what had happened, seemed to validate the idea. That was 2 days ago, and the nightmare has, without a doubt, cemented itself as reality. As the sun goes down, everything becomes quiet, and the air turns cold. And from the trees, beginning with light echoes, comes the chatter. I can hear it rustling between the treetops, moving from side to side. The chattering penetrates my body like shell shock, draining me of thought and spirit. When I hear that click, 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 it feels like a hammer slowly cracking away at my bones, turning them into dust that enters my bloodstream and poisons my body. I'm tired of the questions I've asked myself. None have answers. I'm tired because I can't sleep. I'm tired because I don't know how to escape. There's nowhere for me to go, and I've found myself relieved only by the artificial hubris of a proud protector, the idea that I will stand my ground and defend what's mine until there's nothing left. And that's really what I'm afraid of, that at the end of all this, there will be nothing left of me. I'm a woman. I'm Chinese, but grew up in Sydney, Australia. However, I was born in Beijing, but on the outskirts of it in a large town called Yungang Residential District, where my mom's family is from. When I was 5, I immigrated to Australia, but my family would still travel back to China every few years. This incident happened in the snowy winter of 1997 when I was 11 years old. My grandparents still lived in Yungang and introduced me to a brother and sister who lived in the same building as them. I can't remember their exact ages, but I think the older girl was around 14 and the younger boy was around 6. I still remember the exact outfit as I was wearing, as I'd been wearing the same outfit all trip. At that time, flared jeans were in, and, coming from Australia, I wasn't prepared for the snow and coldness of the Chinese winter, and so on my first or second day there, my Chinese cousin had taken me to a shopping mall where she'd helped me haggle down the price of a bright pink duffel coat with fluffy white trimming. I thought it was the most fashionable thing ever, haha, and wore it every day. I have photos of me from the trip wearing that exact outfit. We walked around town and ended up going to a very large park with a lake inside it. It was a little bit of a distance from the center of town. We were playing by the shore, throwing rocks, joking around, and having a good time. At some point, I looked up and realized it was getting dusky. Although it probably wasn't very late, but considering it was winter, the sun set early. The park, which had never been very busy to start with, was nearly deserted. There were still some other people, but they were a fair distance away from us. All except for two men who suddenly approached us. They were middle to late middle-aged, the uncle type. One of them approached me and said he was a friend of my father's and that he'd asked him to pick us up. I remember being confused because my dad didn't live in this town and was in another district about 2 hours away in Beijing where his family were from. Pretty quick I realized something was off, and so did the brother-sister I was with. We all started making excuses and backing off. I still remember very clearly that as we started backing away, the man who approached us looked back over his shoulder at his companion as if asking him what he should do. His companion was standing a little distance away beside a white van with the door already slid open. I completely believed that he was considering snatching one of us and making a run for it. However, perhaps because there were 3 of us and perhaps because there were still people around in the peripheries, they didn't do anything. As I walked away rapidly, I looked back over my shoulder and remember seeing the 2 men just standing there, watching us go. That 15 to 20 minute walk back was one of the scariest walks in my life, as I imagined someone grabbing me from behind every second. The sun set just as we got into my building and burst in through the door, so happy to be home safe. I did tell my mom and grandmother about it, but at that time child kidnappings in China, while already definitely happening, were much less of a massive and widespread news story as it is now. I think my mom especially felt that my being almost kidnapped was somehow a commentary on her parenting skills and was very dismissive, and even now dislikes it when I bring it up. Now that organized child and or bride kidnappings are such a huge story in China, it often makes me shiver at night to think how different my fate could have been. There have been so many stories about young women/girls kidnapped and forced into becoming brides of villagers in remote countrysides, sometimes tied to beds and having their legs broken to prevent them running away. They're forced to bear children one after another. No one in the village will help them because almost all the men in the village have purchased brides from traffickers in this way. There's also children, usually boys, kidnapped into families who have been unable to have kids or adopt legally. They fare a bit better but can also be abused and neglected. Now that I have my own kids and safe and warm in my bed in Sydney, I sometimes think about how wildly and irrevocably my life might have derailed that snowy evening in Yungang and shiver. Hi. Some context first. This story took place in 2020 when I was 18 years old. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, but my country does have a high crime rate in general, so take that with a pinch of salt. My dad had passed away earlier in the year, and I had no siblings, so my mom and I lived alone in our house. The COVID lockdowns were still in place, but as certain restrictions were lifted, people were starting to return to work. Between my house and the train tracks was a stretch of empty field. It became a safe, quiet space for me to escape to whenever I needed to get out of the house. I would normally sit there once a day for a cigarette or two, sometimes for a little picnic. My home situation was complicated, to say the least, and due to the pandemic I had nowhere else to go. On this particular day, I went there for a few minutes to smoke, as always. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed a young man walking along the train tracks on the other side of the field. He was barefoot and wearing dirty, worn-out clothes. He noticed me and made a hand gesture suggesting that he was asking for a smoke. I should have just left, but as a teenager, I found it difficult to say no to people. I walked across the field and handed him a smoke. He took it from me, and I immediately felt uneasy with the way he was looking at me. He asked me, "Don't you live in that house over there?" and pointed at my house. I avoided answering the question, and at this point realized that I needed to leave. I had left from my front gate that day. For him to know where I lived, he must have watched me leave from the back gate before. I told him I needed to get going. He started insisting on giving me a hug to say thank you, and I declined several times. At this point, I turned around and started walking away quickly. I didn't get very far. He caught up to me and put his arm around my waist. I panicked, not knowing what to do. All I could think of was that I needed to get away. As I tried to start running, he grabbed me from behind and started dragging me toward the row of houses where the view from the road is completely blocked. The fences were high too, so no one could see the field from their backyards. We were completely isolated. I was kicking and struggling, desperate to get out of his grasp. He ended up throwing me on the ground, with him on top of me, still holding on. In a split second, my life flashed before my eyes. That feeling that something terrible was about to happen came over me. I couldn't escape, he was too strong. My arms were trapped by his, and he was holding me down, so I couldn't kick him. I did the only thing left to do, and I started screaming for help. Suddenly I was free. I could move. He had let go and jumped off of me. He ran away. My heart was still pounding. I was shaking, in shock from what had just happened. He disappeared into the industrial area on the other side of the train tracks. I immediately ran towards the road. As I reached it, I noticed it was empty. There were no cars parked in my neighbors' driveways. No one heard me screaming, and had he realized, that day could have had a far worse ending. He knew where I lived, and I was terrified of him returning. For months, I had panic attacks and nightmares, and I could barely leave my house without breaking down. I moved away from there a year later, but I still sometimes get scared when I'm home alone or walking around town. Thankfully, I never saw him again, and I hope that I never will.